the nanny who became family. When María Teresa Turrion Borrallo first stepped through the gates of Kensington Palace in 2014, few outside the royal circle took much notice. She wore the brown Norland College uniform, carried herself with quiet dignity, and slipped into her duties with little fanfare. To the press, she was just another nanny, but to Prince George, then less than a year old, she would soon become much more. For nearly a decade, María was not simply an employee of the royal household. She was a constant presence in the life of a boy destined to become king. In the quiet halls of Kensington Palace, on long-haul royal tours, in moments the cameras never captured, she became a steady anchor in a childhood that could have so easily been defined by chaos, duty, and relentless attention. A childhood unlike any other. Raising any child is demanding, but raising a child who is both a toddler and a future monarch is something else entirely. Prince George was born into a world where every milestone, his first smile, his first words, even his first steps, was the subject of global fascination. William and Catherine, the Prince and Princess of Wales, knew their son's life would never be ordinary. They wanted, as much as possible, for him to have the grounding of a normal childhood. That was why they turned to Norland College, the elite nanny training institution in Bath that has supplied caregivers to royal families and the global elite for more than a century. From this institution came María Teresa Turrion Borrallo, a Spanish-born nanny with a reputation for quiet competence, warmth, and professionalism. For George, she was more than staff. She was someone he could trust without question, someone who existed outside the politics of the palace or the glare of the paparazzi. María became the one constant presence in a young boy's world where faces and places changed constantly. Beyond the uniform, Maria's arrival marked a subtle but important shift. The palace hadn't just hired a caretaker to supervise nap times and serve meals. They had brought in someone with both discipline and emotional intelligence, someone who could navigate the immense pressures of raising a royal child while keeping his world tender and secure. Her Norland training was thorough. Everything from nutrition and child psychology to evasive driving techniques for emergencies. But no training could fully prepare her for the realities of life inside the royal nursery. What set María apart wasn't just her credentials, but her intuition. She learned George's moods and rhythms quickly, understanding when he needed comfort, when he needed structure, and when he simply needed space. At times when palace life overwhelmed him, the flashbulbs, the handshakes, the expectations, María was the quiet presence in the corner, guiding him back to calm with a word, a song, or even just a reassuring glance. Building a bond, her bond with George wasn't forged in dramatic gestures, but in thousands of small, quiet moments. She was there for the scraped knees after a fall in the palace gardens. She soothed his bedtime fears when thunder rattled the windows. She encouraged his questions, even when they were awkward ones about why people waved at their car or why strangers cared so much about his family. María knew that George would one day inherit immense responsibility, but she also knew that, at his core, he was still a child. She taught him to name his feelings rather than hide them, helping him navigate emotions that could easily overwhelm a young boy under constant scrutiny. In a household often defined by protocol and tradition, her gentle approach stood out. She also introduced George to her own Spanish heritage, sprinkling in words and songs from her native language. It became a private language between them, a secret connection no one else shared. Even at public events, they could exchange a word or phrase in Spanish, and George would smile knowingly. The quiet protector. Even when María wasn't in the spotlight, she was never far away. At official engagements, she lingered just out of camera range, ready to step in with a guiding word or a hand on George's shoulder when the crowds and noise became too much. To the public, she was invisible. To George, she was always there. Those who worked around the family often remarked on how Maria's presence seemed to steady the young prince. Unlike bodyguards or advisors, she wasn't there to enforce rules or represent the crown. She was there to care. In the lonely and formal world of palace life, that distinction mattered. Her sacrifices were many. María gave up much of her personal life, declining other opportunities so she could remain available for George at all times. Holidays, weekends, late nights. Her world revolved around ensuring his well-being. Where others might have sought recognition or advantage from their royal connection, she sought none. Her loyalty was absolute, her discretion unwavering, a teacher as much as a nanny. What the public rarely understood was how much María shaped George's early education, not just academically, but emotionally. She encouraged his love of animals by bringing books on wildlife, helping him identify birds in the palace gardens, and nurturing his curiosity about the natural world. She introduced routines that made daunting experiences manageable: a favorite song before long car rides, a quiet game to ease nerves before events, small rituals that gave him stability amid the unpredictable rhythms of royal life. She modeled kindness in the way she spoke to staff and treated those around her. These subtle lessons stayed with George, shaping the way he interacted with others even as his public role grew. At a charity event, onlookers once noted how the young prince bent down to help a younger child who had dropped their toys. To many, it was a sweet gesture. To those who knew Maria, it was her quiet influence showing through, the invisible sacrifice. For nearly a decade, Maria lived her life in service not just to the crown, but to the child at its center. Her own personal identity faded into the background. She didn't seek interviews or public attention. Unlike others who had served royals and later published memoirs, she remained utterly silent, her loyalty intact even beyond her official duties. Yet those close to her noted the sacrifices this required. Friends saw less of her. Opportunities outside the palace were declined. Her own future seemed indefinitely tied to George's present. Still, she accepted this with grace. For Maria, the bond she had with George was enough. She had always known that nannies come and go, that eventually her role would shrink as George grew into school, sports, and the rituals of royal training. But she hoped, quietly, that the impression she left would be lasting, the making of a royal childhood. Maria's years with George were formative ones. They were the years of scraped knees and bedtime stories, of whispered questions and secret jokes, of learning to navigate a childhood unlike any other. She was there through the milestones that the public only glimpsed in carefully staged photos. His first words, his first steps, his first fears and triumphs. What the world saw was a smiling boy in polished shoes waving to the crowd. What they didn't see was the woman just behind him, making sure he felt safe enough to wave. María Teresa Turrion Borrallo may have entered Kensington Palace as an employee, but she became something much deeper. For Prince George, she was not just the woman in the brown uniform. She was comfort. She was security. She was family. And though her role was destined to change as George grew, the imprint of those early years would remain forever. Signs the end was near. From the outside, nothing seemed to change. María Teresa Turrion Borrallo still appeared in her discreet brown Norland uniform. She was still the quiet figure walking behind the Prince and Princess of Wales during public appearances, still the watchful eye at the edge of photographs, still the woman who knew how to calm Prince George with a glance. But inside the walls of Kensington Palace, subtle shifts signaled that her role, the most intimate, most trusted position in George's young life, was beginning to wind down. As George grew older, his days filled less with nursery routines and more with lessons, responsibilities, and carefully shaped public experiences. Where once Maria had read him stories at bedtime, tutors now guided him through history lessons and mathematics. Where once she had answered his endless questions about the world. Why soldiers stood so still at Buckingham Palace, why photographers shouted his name, advisors and educators now provided the official answers. Maria remained present, but the space she filled began to shrink, a shift in George's world. By the time George turned 8, the palace's vision for his future was clear. His childhood was no longer just about playtime and comfort. It was preparation. New advisors joined his circle, specialists in leadership, language, and royal protocol. These were the figures who would mold him into a king in waiting. Maria noticed the shift immediately. Where once she guided George through the anxieties of a crowded event, now he was coached by palace staff to stand taller, to smile on cue, to shake hands with firmness. She still whispered reassurances when needed, but increasingly, George looked to others for guidance. For Maria, the realization was bittersweet. She had always known her role was temporary. Nannies are there to nurture the early years, not to shape the public figure a child becomes. Still, knowing it did not make it easier. The boy who once ran to her with drawings, who shared a secret Spanish word before bed, was growing into a young prince with duties far beyond the nursery. Preparing to let go, those closest to Maria noticed the quiet ways she prepared for the inevitable. She began leaving detailed notes for George's tutors, lists of his routines, preferences, and small comforts that helped him feel secure. She tidied the nursery more carefully, as though preserving memories in the spaces they had once shared. On some evenings, she lingered a little longer by the palace gardens, watching George play from a distance, knowing her place was slowly moving to the sidelines. Her devotion never faltered. She never complained, never questioned. But the subtle melancholy in her eyes revealed that she understood what was coming. Inside palace walls, private discussions had begun. William and Catherine deeply valued Maria's loyalty and devotion. They knew how much she had given, how much she had sacrificed, and how much George had benefited from her presence. But they also knew that their son was entering a new stage of life, one where his emotional world needed to be balanced with preparation for the crown. And so, with deliberation and care, they made the decision to let her go. The day of farewell. The day Maria had long anticipated arrived quietly. There was no public announcement, no press release, no whisper to the media. It was handled as discreetly as every part of her service had been. Inside a private room at Kensington Palace, Maria sat across from William and Catherine. The atmosphere was respectful, even warm. This was no dismissal of failure. It was the natural end of a chapter. They thanked her deeply for everything she had done. For the scraped knees she bandaged, the sleepless nights she soothed, the laughter she brought to a boy who would one day carry the weight of a nation.
In their private
Maria
residence,
listened quietly,
Catherine
her
pressed for the
expression
truth.
composed.
She sat
She
with
had
George,
always known this day
listened
would
carefully,
come.
and what she
Yet
heard
beneath
chilled
the
her.
calm surface,
This was not
the weight
simple
of
play.
parting pressed heavily. This was not just a job ending. This was the close of nearly a decade of love, trust, and daily life with the boy she had helped raise. And then Catherine said the words that made the moment truly real. George already knows. He wants to talk to you. A conversation to remember. Maria found George sitting quietly near a window, a drawing pad in his lap. When he looked up, his expression was serious, far older than his years. "Mom told me," he said softly, "I don't want things to change." It was the kind of heartbreak only a child could express, with pure honesty, without disguise. Maria knelt beside him. She gave the gentle smile he knew so well and said, "You're growing up, and it's time. That's what makes you strong." George didn't argue. Instead, he looked at her as if trying to hold on to every detail of the moment. The sound of her voice, the warmth of her presence. The room was silent, but the silence spoke louder than any words. Her last morning. The next morning, Maria went about her duties one final time. She packed the few belongings she kept in the staff quarters: a worn notebook, a framed drawing George had given her when he was 5, a cardigan she wore on cool mornings. At breakfast, she sat beside George as she always had. They ate quietly, stretching the moment, both aware it would not come again. When the meal ended, George handed her a small wrapped gift. Inside was a leather notebook. On the first page, in careful, childlike handwriting, were the words, "Thank you for being my first teacher." Maria held the book to her chest, her composure nearly breaking. She kissed the top of his head, knowing this would be one of her final gestures of affection as his nanny. That afternoon, she walked down the back steps of Kensington Palace, the same steps she had climbed countless times over nearly a decade. No photographers waited. No announcements marked her departure. It was the quiet end of a chapter written not in headlines, but in the private moments of a boy's childhood. Palace silence to the outside world, nothing had changed. Prince George still appeared at public events, still waved to crowds, still smiled shyly beside his parents. But those who knew him best recognized the absence. The steady, comforting presence of Maria was gone. The palace made no statement about her departure. There was no thank you issued to the press, no formal acknowledgement of her service. In keeping with tradition, the role of the nanny was to remain invisible, even in leaving. But behind closed doors, emotions ran deeper. William and Catherine were said to have been deeply grateful, even moved, by her years of loyalty. They knew George's foundation. The empathy, kindness, and steadiness he carried was in part because of Maria. Yet they also believed firmly that it was time for him to rely on a wider team, to step into the world of responsibility that awaited him. The weight of goodbye. For Maria, the departure was both an ending and a beginning. She had given nearly a decade of her life to a single family, to a single child. She had sacrificed personal opportunities, friendships, and even her own privacy. And yet, when the moment came to walk away, she did so with dignity and grace. In the staff corridors, a few colleagues whispered their sadness at seeing her go. To them, she had been a role model, loyal, professional, and discreet. But even they knew Maria would never tell her story. She carried her memories not for public consumption, but for herself. and perhaps for George, who would one day remember the woman who had guided him through his earliest years. Life after the palace. When María Teresa Turrion Borrallo left Kensington Palace, she stepped into a silence she hadn't known in nearly a decade. For years, her life had been defined by early mornings filled with children's laughter, tightly scheduled routines, and the quiet but constant presence of Britain's future king. Now, the palace gates closed behind her, and the rhythm that had once dictated her every day was suddenly gone. At first, she welcomed the stillness. Her modest West London home became her sanctuary. No courtiers, no flashing cameras, no endless schedules, just peace. But beneath the calm lay the weight of separation. For almost 10 years, she had dedicated her life to one child. Now, she had to rediscover herself outside of him. Offers poured in quickly. Wealthy families, both in Britain and abroad, reached out through Norland College and private connections. One aristocratic family in Belgravia offered a salary fit for royalty, eager for Maria to shape their children's early years. Others tried to entice her with prestige or connections. She declined them all. It wasn't that she doubted her ability or lacked appreciation for the offers. It was that her heart wasn't ready. After giving so much of herself to Prince George, stepping into another nursery so soon felt impossible. A private adjustment. Maria withdrew into her private circle. She visited old friends, including a retired nanny in Bath who had once served another branch of the aristocracy. They would sit together over tea, talking about the strange life of caring for children who are not your own, how deeply attached you become, and how quietly devastating it is to let go. When people asked about George, her answers were polite but brief. "Of course, I miss him," she admitted once, her voice steady but soft, but she shared no stories, no details. Her loyalty was intact, as unshakable as it had been inside palace walls. The palace, for its part, sent only minimal updates. A short note assured her that George was thriving under his new team of advisors and tutors. A small parcel arrived one day containing a cardigan she had left behind, a forgotten notebook, and a drawing of a dog George had made for her. She tucked the items away quietly, without comment, the move that shocked everyone. For months, Maria lived a deliberately quiet life. No interviews, no memoirs, no attempt to capitalize on her royal connection. But then, without warning, she made a move that stunned both the palace and the public. She began volunteering at a small community charity in London, one dedicated to supporting vulnerable children from struggling families. It was not glamorous work. Reading to children, helping prepare snacks, assisting with after-school activities, but it was the kind of service she valued. What shocked people wasn't that Maria was volunteering, it was how she did it. She arrived without fanfare, wore simple clothes, and introduced herself just as Maria. There were no photographers, no announcement. She didn't trade on her royal past or use her experience to attract headlines. She simply served. When a passerby snapped a photo of her kneeling to tie the shoelaces of a little boy at the charity, the image spread across social media. Almost overnight, Maria became a symbol, not of the monarchy, but of humility. Public reaction. The response was overwhelming. Donations to the small charity surged, fueled by admiration for Maria's quiet gesture. Volunteers signed up in record numbers, many citing her example as their inspiration. People online praised her dignity, contrasting her humility with the more polished, carefully managed appearances of royal figures. She raised a prince. One commenter wrote, "But this is the kind of queenly behavior we need more of." For once, Maria was not invisible. Her influence had stepped beyond palace walls, touching people who had never paid attention to royal nannies before. The palace's quiet response. Inside the palace, her unexpected visibility sparked debate. Advisors questioned whether letting her go had been the right decision. On paper, the choice had been logical. George was older, his world expanding, and nannies are not meant to follow princes into adolescence. But emotionally, Maria had been more than a nanny. She had been his steadying force, his bridge between childhood and duty. Some aides reportedly worried that removing such a stabilizing figure too soon might leave George unsettled at a crucial stage. Others, however, argued that independence was necessary, that no matter how beloved she was, George had to learn to stand without her. William and Catherine, sources suggested, held no bitterness toward Maria's volunteer work. They trusted her discretion completely and admired her choice to serve. Yet they could not have anticipated how powerfully her quiet action would resonate with the public. A legacy beyond the palace. Maria's legacy did not end with her departure. Those who had worked alongside her remarked on how much George's character reflected her influence. He was polite, empathetic, and observant, traits nurtured by the gentle hand that had guided him in his earliest years. At public events, subtle echoes of Maria remain. The way George bent down to comfort a younger child, the way he greeted staff warmly, the patience he showed when overwhelmed by attention. These small behaviors carried her imprint, invisible but undeniable. Beyond George himself, Maria became a model for other nannies and caregivers. She proved that loyalty and discretion could coexist with deep emotional influence. She showed that even in the most formal households, love and kindness could shape a child's inner world more than any protocol. Choosing silence. Despite her new visibility, Maria never broke her silence. She declined interview requests, rejected offers for book deals, and ignored lucrative opportunities to tell her story. In an age where many would have cashed in on such connections, her refusal only deepened public respect. Instead, she quietly continued her charity work, lending her time and skills to children who needed her most. She became, in the eyes of many, a symbol of integrity, proof that service could be both humble and transformative. Her story was powerful precisely because it wasn't told in her own words. It was told in the way she lived. Could the palace have handled it differently? As admiration for Maria grew, whispers of regret spread quietly through palace corridors. Some aides wondered aloud whether there had been a way to keep her involved, even in a reduced role. Could she have remained as a mentor figure, someone George could still turn to privately, even as tutors and advisors took the lead? Others remained firm that the decision had been right. George's path was not about comfort, it was about preparation. He could not remain dependent on a nanny forever, no matter how beloved she was. The balance between childhood affection and royal duty had to tilt toward the crown eventually. Ultimately, the palace stayed silent. They offered no public acknowledgement of Maria's service, no statement of thanks for nearly a decade of loyalty. In keeping with tradition, her role was to remain invisible, even after her departure. But to the public, her absence, and her quiet reappearance in the charity world, spoke louder than any statement could. The legacy she left behind. Maria's legacy is not written in official records or history books. It is written in the private heart of a boy who will one day be king. She taught him empathy in a world that often demands distance. She showed him kindness in a palace where protocol often ruled. She helped him understand that even the smallest gestures, tying a shoe, listening to a question, offering a smile, can carry enormous weight. In many ways, she gave George the tools not just to reign, but to lead with humanity. And though she now walks far from the palace corridors, her influence endures in subtle, profound ways. María Teresa Turrion Borrallo may never hold a title, never stand on a balcony, never appear in history books beside kings and queens. But for nearly a decade, she shaped one. And in the quiet grace of her life after the palace, she reminded the world that true power often lies not in crowns or titles, but in humility. Her chapter inside Kensington Palace has ended, but her story continues. To this day, Maria remains a figure of fascination, not because of scandal or betrayal, but because of her steadfast silence, her unwavering loyalty, and her choice to continue serving quietly in a world obsessed with spectacle. And that, perhaps, is the greatest legacy of all.